It's lovely to see some well-kent faces on the screen, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of my reflections on reflective practice. Some of you may have heard some of this before when I did a bit for Charlie earlier last year. And so hopefully it's not too repetitive for everybody. But as Patrick said, if you feel that you want to interrupt, I'd rather we could do this in a more discursive way than it just being another lecture. Now, I am going to share my screen. So for a minute, you will just see yourselves. And then I'm going to put my presentation up. That does mean that I won't easily see everybody. But if you're able to just interrupt at any point, then that would be great. So hopefully you can see the first of my slides. If somebody could just confirm that that's the case, then that would be brilliant. Yeah, okay, thank you, Heather. Thank you for that, as I said, that introduction, Patrick. It was fascinating. What Patrick didn't tell you is that both of us were lost in the Graham Hills building that night when we started our MSc. And didn't have a clue where we were going. As Patrick kindly said in his introduction, I started life as a secondary school teacher and ended up in educational leadership and management for Renfrewshire Council before leaving at the end of last year. The venture that we've recently set out on is a sort of conglomeration of different things. But one aspect of that is that I'm an associate tutor for Strathclyde University's Into Headship programme, which is the qualification that teachers need if they want to become a head teacher. And a lot of my reflection and thinking has been around about the synergies that there are across professional boundaries. And it was really interesting to listen to Tom this morning talk about that in relation to medical practice. And I could see some of what you were saying, Tom, this morning, and how that reflected in my own experience coming from an educational background. So I'm going to talk a wee bit about learning this afternoon, and a wee bit about how I think that impacts on what it means for us to be reflective practitioners as mediators. And I was also particularly struck by what Michael had to say in his keynote and his pillars of reflective practice. And hopefully what you will see as we discuss this afternoon will be reflected in here. I'm going to sort of think a little bit about some tensions that you could perceive to be the case between reflective practice and some other things. So when we think a bit about learning, do we see that as a theoretical project? Is it about cramming stuff into our heads, or is it about something that's actually much more to do with practice? And I'm then going to pose the question is inquiry and reflective practice, is that something that we do as a stance? In other words, is it an epistemological position, or is it a project that we get involved with? And then to look at that in light of some theories around about learning to do with deep and surface learning, and I'm going to refer to some work that specifically relates to university level learning about deep and surface learning, and whether learning is an individual thing that we do as students or as practitioners in one way or another, or is it something much more collaborative? And Charlie and others will recognize quite quickly that I will veer off into the work of Morton Deutsch and two of his students, Johnson and Johnson, which led to a lot of the movement in Scotland around cooperative learning. And then some thinking around about formative and summative assessment or evaluation. And it was interesting again that Michael picked up on that. And then some of my own thinking around about accountability and autonomy, and particularly how that relates to supervision. So those are some of the tensions that I thought we could try and reflect on as we go through in what will probably be a fairly whistle-stop tour over the next half an hour or so. Now, before we do that, if you've got either a mobile phone there, or if you've got a web browser, could I ask you to do something that will make this a little bit more interactive and engaging? Could you go to menti.com, and then could you enter the code 6479022? And as you do that, then you will be presented with an initial question, and that's to just give us a wee bit of interactivity. And what I will do is I've now, hopefully, there we go, got a screen in front of me. And if you are behaving and cooperating with me, then I will start to see things begin to appear on my screen that show that you've clicked on one of the buttons. So hopefully you should be able to see a screen. It says, are you ready? And yep, so we've got 2 folk have said they're ready already. So that's good. So I'm hoping that more than 2 of us are there to join in, because that will help me just to get a sense of where we're going. Good, that's really helpful. As I said, we're not a big group, but it will give us a wee bit of a sense of interactivity. And if you're struggling with that, that's okay. Please don't worry about it. I don't want us to spend a huge amount of time. But maybe just to make sure that this is working and that you're engaging with us today, somebody this morning asked if you enter where you're from. I'm sitting in my office in our house in the south side of Glasgow. It's been raining all morning. Now I wonder if that's Houston in Renfrewshire, or whether it's Houston in Texas. But we've got folk beginning to say where we're from. That's really helpful, thank you. It just gives us a wee sense of, by doing this today, we've been able to do something that allows us to come together without us necessarily being in a geographical space, which is really helpful. So thank you for that. And then the real question that I just wanted to pose as we start out on our journey is this one. What is it that you think about when you think about learning? That's a question that often people pose at the start of something, but I wonder what do you think about when you think about learning? So I'm going to just be quiet for a minute and allow you to reflect on that question and maybe to type something in so that we can all share that. So the first one out the blocks is somebody said improving. Practice, new experience. I'll need to move the screen a wee bit. New knowledge, integration, reading, writing, talking, having a go. Maybe it's not surprising that it's something organized by university, then the comments that are coming up are positive comments about learning. If I were to ask that question of a group of 14-year-old boys, I might get quite a different answer. I might get an answer that talked about it being boring or something that you have to do. So it's interesting that when you think about learning, you're thinking about something positive. That's not everybody's experience. So I want to hold those thoughts as we go through what we actually think about from a group of people who are clearly those who engage positively with learning and think quite carefully about it. So hold that. You can put your phone aside just now. We're going to go back to the presentation and I have a bit of a think about what we're thinking about when we're thinking about learning. So I'm going to start with this about theory or practice. And this is a quote that I came across some time ago from a training manual for the Mennonite Conciliation Service, who do, they actually do a program called Bridge Builders. And I spotted this quote and it really struck me as something really important about action and reflection. In other words, that Latin word praxis. And maybe when we think about a tension between theory or practice, maybe it's not so much a tension, but actually maybe reflective practice, I would suggest, is something that must be both. It must be both theory and practice, reflection and action. And I think that is something that within the education world is something that is particularly highlighted. Well, over 10 years ago, there was a very important piece of research done around about teachers learning, as opposed to children and young people's learning, about teachers learning. And one of the things that Donaldson highlighted in that report, which shaped the way that both initial teacher education happens and lifelong learning for teachers continues, is this, and I'm just going to read it for us. The most successful education systems invest in developing their teachers as reflective, accomplished, and inquiring professionals who are able not simply to teach successfully in relation to current external expectations, but who have the capacity to engage fully with the complexities of education and to be key actors in shaping and leading educational change. So there has been a very definite shift within education circles in Scotland about making reflective practice key to who teachers are, not just about what they do. And that link to inquiry is something that is key. And one of the texts that we use in the Into Headship programme is about this, is by Paula Wozniak-Myers, who talks very importantly about reflective practice being a disposition to inquiry. And it's something that we seek to try and instill in teachers, that they don't just automatically do. It's not a technician activity. It is something that is far more important than that. It's about a disposition. And Tom this morning talked about reflective practice in Donald Shawn's seminal work, The Reflective Practitioner. And when we're looking at reflective practice for teachers, we quite often use this diagram in order to help us consider what it looks like. And I would like to suggest that this is a model that mediators can use as well. Reflecting in action, in other words, thinking on our feet. So we're in that mediation room, we're thinking about what we do next, what is the next step that we take, what happened, why did that person just blow up at us, what was it that was going on there? And that's what a teacher does all the time when they're in the classroom. They are thinking on their feet about what question to ask next, where to go with the discussion, is there a tangent that they need to go off on? But the second part of that reflective practice cycle, I think, is about reflecting on action. In other words, thinking retrospectively, looking back at what happened. And if you're part of the mediation clinic, that's really what the review paperwork is about, isn't it? It's about reflecting on what happened during the mediation that we were involved in, and trying to write evaluatively rather than just descriptively. I think there's always a danger in any reflection that it becomes about we did this, then we did this, then we did that. And actually that descriptive action is the trivial bit of the exercise, and it's the evaluative bit that we should be interested in. The so what question, and I'll come back to so what in a minute. And then I think the third part, which is I think is less clear in Donald Shawn's work, but it's that bit about, well, what about the so what? What will we do differently next time? So reflecting upon our action, in other words, reflecting prospectively, so that what we do the next time might be different. And I think that form of reflective practice is something that we try and teach teachers to do. And I would suggest that as mediators, it can be helpful for us to be thinking about as well. Also, as teachers, there's other research by Brookfield which talks about using critical lenses as teachers. And the critical lenses there that are being highlighted are about who we are as teachers and learners, but then also thinking about looking at it through our students' eyes, through our colleagues' experiences, and through theoretical literature. And I find those four critical lenses to be really helpful in the context of who we are as mediators. Who we are.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you,
Yep,
but
sorry,
you said
Patrick.
people should. I'm not sure who you can see on your screen, but Tom has got his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Right, Tom, go for it.
You're muted, Tom.
How do you learn to be reflective in action? I know we say you should do that and experts do it. I suppose I'm at a stage in mediation where I'm not doing that very well. I did it well when I was a doctor, but I suppose that's expertise over time. But I'm really concentrating on the process, I suppose, at the moment in mediations, and I'm not able to listen as carefully as I did when I was a doctor. How do you teach me to do that in mediation?
Oh gosh, I think, Tom, that's a whole, that's probably way beyond what we've got time for this afternoon, but it's one that I actually find really interesting, because you talked about it from the point of view of the doctor and now becoming a mediator and the artistry of the mediator, and it's maybe something that Charlie would reflect on later. But I'm coming at it from the point of view of the teacher and how the teacher does it in practice. Mm-hmm. And maybe what I would suggest is some of the things I'm going to talk about in a few minutes might help towards that, but I don't think I'm going to be able to give you a full answer, Tom. Is that okay? But I think it's an important question for us, and it's one that I'm going to come back to later.
Okay.
Is that all right? So these are the four lenses that I think we encourage teachers to think through, and I'm going to suggest that actually we can do that ourselves as mediators as well. And one of the ways that we do that as teachers is this expression called practitioner inquiry. And so we encourage teachers to actually take a stance around about their practice. And this maybe begins to address what you're asking there about, Tom. And that is that as a teacher, we ask that they take a view that everything that they do should be open to their inquiry. Now, there is a tension there, because that level of engagement is something that is relatively straightforward to do in the past tense. So you can look back on what you did. What is far harder to do is to actually think about that strategic finding out when you're in the midst of something. However, if you look at this from the point of view of being in something rather than being the observer of something, then you're much more likely, I think, to be able to start to ask good questions of yourselves. Now, Kate Wall, who's mentioned here, is also a lecturer at Strathclyde and leads the doctorate program in education. And she displays it like this, where we think, is inquiry a stance or is it a project? And how can the two begin to come together? So that as we reflect in and on our practice, actually maybe who we are and what we do begin to come together. So that would be the first thing that I would want to say around about reflective practice. But then I want to go on and think a little bit around about learning and what we mean by learning from an educational standpoint. And and again, Tom, you mentioned this morning around about the work of John Dewey from 80, 90 years ago. And actually the focus of the conference last year at this time recalled the work of John Dewey around about experiential learning. And this particular diagram is taken from the work of David Kolb. You'll see here that there's a a sense of taking our concrete experience and then reflecting on that experience in order that we can actually make some sort of sense of it before we then plan what we might do next. And within the education world, that last box there about active experimentation is something that we often use something called the plan, do, study, act cycle, which is a little model where you take a small test of change and you highlight something small that you want to experiment with in order to try and isolate it in amongst everything else. Because one of the things that I think that we will all find as reflective practitioners, in the same way that teachers find in the classroom, is that it's really difficult to isolate one small part of the story. And that can be extremely difficult for us. So if you can try and change one variable and see what happens with that one variable, you might begin to be able to do things differently in the future. However, the caution for me in amongst that is that anything around about learning or anything around about the mediation room is actually such an organic human set of complexities that it's really difficult to isolate one thing. And maybe pose that as a question for later and for further reflection. Now, many of you will also have heard around about work on what is called learning styles. Now, I've also put in brackets here, proceed with caution, because there's actually an awful lot of bunkum talked around about learning styles. However, the main piece of work around about this started with the researchers Honey and Munford. Again, it's around about 35 to 40 years ago. And they highlighted 4 types of learning, if you like: activist, reflector. And there you go, you'll see that word again, reflection, appearing there, about considering options, observing, and retaining a sense of perspective. The theorist and the pragmatist. And what they suggested was that we each have a preference towards a type of learning style. And what that tended to lead to at that point was that in a lot of classrooms, we had teachers beginning to think, actually, what I need to do therefore is to make sure that I match the learning style of my learners so that they can learn best in their preferred method. What I would tend to suggest, however, is that actually if learning styles is any basis whatsoever, then it should be about challenging that learning style rather than just going along with it. So if you, for example, find it easy to sit and listen to a lecture, then perhaps what I want to do is do what Charlie does in the course and put you into a role play, because by being uncomfortable in that position, you may actually be more likely to learn better. So I'm going to let some of these things just rest, because we don't have a huge amount of time this afternoon, but just to be aware of that when it comes to learning. This particular research was based around university learning, and it's particularly helpful, I think, when we think about types of learning and the approaches that we can take. And something I'm going to say in a minute around about formative and summative approaches are particularly important when it comes to thinking about the supervision of mediators, I believe. Now, by sitting in a lecture, taking some notes, or actually sitting listening to me, then actually maybe what you're taking part in is something that's quite surface and passive, and that maybe you're not actually thinking about what's being said, in the same way that if you read a journal or a book, you may just skim over it and not really learn anything in particular. What could also be reasonably lightweight is that active approach, where you're actually maybe beginning to be a bit more active in something. However, it's not really touching you deeply. And what becomes really important is where you start to move towards learning that is both deep and active. And I think that's where, when we begin to start to think about reflective practice, that's the quadrant we really need to be getting into, so that it's not something that is superficial in any way. A deep approach to learning is dependent upon having prior knowledge and understanding on which to draw. And this first bullet point, I think, is particularly important when we're thinking about reflecting in action, is that it's not just about the implicit actions that we take, but it's also therefore about what we know that we can draw on. How deep is the well that we draw on, if you like, when we are reflecting ourselves? You'll notice there that second bullet about surface approaches often associated with rote learning. And I was fascinated with the MSc in particular. When I did the MSc, was that there were no end-on exams. You know, end of course exams are often associated with rote learning and surface learning. And it's quite interesting that that debate about how we assess things, particularly within the education sphere in Scotland, still often focuses on end of course examination, where we take what's in our head and we dump it onto a piece of paper, as opposed to deep learning, which actually is something that we'll be able to hold on to for much longer. So there's that aspect of things. I then want to move in briefly into what's often termed social learning theory. As human beings, we are social beings. And actually what I would contest is that good learning will very often take place with others, as opposed to independently. And that's one of the reasons why I think co-mediation can be very, very powerful when it comes to our own learning, and the reflections that come about after the exercise, because you've been learning with somebody else. And social learning, I think, is also that whole sense that, and I mentioned Morton Deutsch earlier, Johnson & Johnson developed an approach to cooperative learning, which has been used extensively in Scottish schools over the last 20 years, whereby it becomes really difficult to be a passive learner, because you're given a role within the learning setting, so that you're actually almost forced to be involved. And I think social learning therefore becomes something that is particularly powerful. And in this particular aspect here, a lot of the research around about social learning would suggest that learning therefore arises from participation in a group, and Wenger talks about communities of practice. I'm conscious of one of the things, Charlie, that you said this morning around about group supervision, and where group supervision actually may allow a community of practice to develop that allows therefore social learning to take place. And so it allows that engaging and contributing to become a part of that reflective practice, which Wenger says it ought to be an integral part of our daily lives, and doesn't always take place in structured opportunities, but that's probably something else that we want to think about. Now, I'm very conscious of time, and I'm not seeing any hands, but if anybody wants to interrupt before I go on, then please do so. I'm not seeing any hands, so I am just going to keep going. In Scottish education, over the last 20 years, there's been a very strong sense of considering the differences between formative and summative assessment. And we often use the term assessment just to refer to what the teacher does, is that they assess. The research that was done by Dylan Williams and Paul Black a number of years ago actually focused on us beginning to separate out the formative from the summative, and recognizing that the formative is far more powerful when it comes to our learning. It is diagnostic, it becomes about growth, and it encourages that sense of deep learning through the use of feedback. Whereas summative assessment and evaluation is often about measurement. It's about where do you rank? Did you get a distinction, a merit, or just a pass? Often about accountability. And many professions use summative evaluation as part of ongoing requirements around about registration or remaining on, some sort of, accountability idea. In order to be a doctor, you must have done. In order to be a registered mediator in Scotland, you must have done 2 mediations, you must have had this amount of CPD. That becomes that summative bit. And one of the problems with summative tools is that they often can lead to surface approaches. You will often hear folk talk about tick box processes, often that at the end of the process, and they are often about high stakes. The higher grade qualifications for young people in Scotland are summative. They are at the end of the course. They're sat in May. Any of you who are parents or grandparents will know that the exams in May are the bit that matters, and the year of learning through doesn't actually matter at all. So how can we make what we do be more formative and less summative, I think is a question for us to be thinking about. So if we think about some of these things to do with learning, then how do we apply that to our particular setting? And I was particularly struck, I recently read Tony Watling's latest book, where he talks quite a bit about supervision and the 3 elements around about accountability, development, and support. And one of the challenges, I think, around about supervision is the way that we focus on or that it's possible to focus on the accountability bit rather than on the development and support bit. Often within the education circles, we talk about teachers as being autonomous and having agency rather than about accountability. And the tension that exists between accountability and autonomy, I think, are actually really significant within the teaching profession. They remain highly significant. Teachers have to renew their registration every 5 years. There's a process called professional update, but it's very easy for that renewal of professional update to become an exercise around accountability that is about superficial learning or surface learning, that is about, how many courses did you attend in the last period of time, and what did you do, what reading did you do, rather than about who you are as a teacher. So there are issues, I think, around about what supervision might look like, and that is a debate that rages on within the education sphere. And I was particularly struck this morning about Charlie's comments around about supervision. What do we talk about? What does that term mean? And what do we take from that word, supervision? So I'm actually just sticking an awful lot of things to the wall this afternoon. And I think as I come towards the end of this, I've got a couple of things to say before we open it up, and we still have a few minutes. First of all, I think learning involves reflecting in on and upon our practice. I think asking good questions of our own practice, that allows deep rather than surface reflection. Engaging with research as a means to generate answers to pertinent questions allows us to look through that lens. And then finally there, I think that being involved in some form of collaborative practitioner inquiry is something that will allow that social learning to generate deep thinking for all of us. And my conclusions, I think, are these. Who you are rather than what you do is what is really important. As we reflect, we need to look for the deep rather than the surface. And working with others wherever possible is so important. And then finally, seeking the formative rather than summative will allow us to make sure that we reflect on those tensions appropriately. And then one final quote from an education researcher is this: that learning takes place at the connection between theory, practice, and person. As mediators, we know that the person is so important as opposed to the process. And I think that the connection, the intersection between theory, practice, and person are really important for us as mediators as well. So that's me. That's what I was wanting to actually try and cover. We've got 5 minutes to open up a bit of a discussion. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which will allow us all to see each other and see if anybody wants to say anything. So thank you, folks.
Thank you. Gordon, in teaching, our practitioners, do they have to keep a reflective journal? And how, if they do, how might that be used within the school?
So a teacher should keep a reflective journal, but it's a personal document, right, and is never shared with anybody. Mm-hmm. It can be used, so a teacher would expect to have an annual review, but their annual review is very much about their professional development and is never associated with competence. So there is always that, there is actually, it's a strange tension in Scottish education that the teacher's professional development is never about their accountability as competent practitioners. So the reflective journal ought to use the standards. So the standards for registration are defined by the General Teaching Council. And the teacher ought to use those standards as a means of evaluating their practice in their reflective journal, but they don't have to share that with anyone. That's a tension.
Mm. In medicine, the tension is that you're more or less forced to do this process of reflection. It's not a voluntary thing now. It's so embedded in it that you have to do it, and it's not such a good way of reflecting. But people are lazy, and if you don't make them do it, very often they don't do it. That's one of the difficulties.
So Tom, can I ask you a question from your perspective in medicine? Then, does that requirement to complete the reflective journal lead to good reflection or surface learning?
I think there's a tendency. It depends on the quality, I think, of the appraiser that's looking at it. That helps as well. If you've got a good appraiser, then you have kind of a really useful discussion about your reflective journals that you create, or reflective reports. If you don't, then it's more superficial, and it's a tick box exercise. And people get, I think Charlie said, people get good at doing these tick box things to satisfy, know what's expected, so they'll do it. So, and then we've got the additional problem that our reflective journals can be used in court against us. So that it's worsened over the past 2 years. We used to put quite a lot of detail in these because we didn't quite understand it can be used in court. And this case I mentioned today, the Bala Garba case, led to them everybody realizing that, and that has inhibited people from creating really useful reflective journals. The nuances of the consultations, etc., the nuances of the errors are not included in the journals now. and then it's a verbal discussion with your appraiser, and you can skim over it more easily.
And that's a really interesting point, Tom, having worked in the public sector for 36 years and very aware of legislation around freedom, both freedom of information and subject access, so GDPR type principles, often I think lead to professionals saying less and less in written form because it can be used against them later.
Can I just make a comment that this is not exactly what you were saying, but thank you very much, Gordon, for your presentation and the learning within that. Lots to look up. I'm very struck by your last comment, and I won't go on about this, but the last slide, who you are rather than what you do. And I think this takes us to virtue ethics, which was sort of mentioned with Aristotle this morning, and it's about being, and that comes over time. It isn't learnt in just like doing a course. It's something that you have to grow into. And I think that might be, I don't know if it's useful or not, but a different way of thinking about it.
Thank you, Barbara. And the older I get and the longer I've practiced in the public sector and in education, the more I believe that who you are is vital.
Yeah.
And it sort of takes you back into that whole sense of artistry that Michael talks about. But also that sense now, who is it that wrote the book Bringing Peace into the Room? Because he talks, the author there talks very much about character and who you are coming into that room. And that although there are skills that you can learn, and it's the same for the teacher, there are skills that you learn as a teacher, but actually it's the who you are bit that, you know, if you think about the best teachers you've ever had, those teachers, it was about who they were. It wasn't about the way that they did things.
Yeah.
Gordon, on that positive note, I think we'll have to bring the workshop to an end. Our time is up. Thank you very, very much. You've given us some very interesting concepts to think about.